We saw last week that any website out there is just code and nothing else. And this is the reason why our job is to write code, and this is why we downloaded a software in which we can write the code in. And then we saw that the World Wide Web is the communication between web browsers and web servers. Web browsers need code in order to display the website. Web servers, they ultimately have the code and they can hand it out to the web browser whenever the web browser wants to have that code. And the browser does want to have it whenever we enter an address inside our address bar or hit a link on a website. So the web server that we have installed last week, that we have over here, is the XAMPP package that we actually installed. And in here there is a folder called htdocs. That is pretty much the only folder that is relevant to us for quite a while. And in here we create our websites. Meaning we create our folders, and each of them, each folder that we create in here, that one will ultimately represent a certain website. And inside that specific folder must the code for that website ultimately be. And this is the reason why we loaded that folder, our website folder, straight into our software in which we write the code in, because then this code gets stored straight away in that folder where it ultimately belongs to. So my website folder is WD216, and whenever we contact now our web server, our local web server that hosts our websites, then it will ask, hey, local web server, give me whatever you have inside the website folder. In my case, WD216. The local web server will take a look in here and it will return whatever is inside the HTML file that's name is index. So this is the reason why we created one of these index files, and because that is the default. Whatever is in here gets returned by default. And now let me hit enter, and what is inside this file, in my case right now, this is the homepage to our first website, and this is what the browser then received, and this is what it displayed on the website. One more last recap for now is this control panel here that we have. Because in here we always need to turn on our web server, and the brand is Apache. So once we have started it, once there is stop, once it is saying stop here, and once it is green here, then we can neglect this window. This is irrelevant for us then. It's only to turn on the web server. And now for this week, what our goal is, of course, we will be starting to write code in HTML, which is the code that we write. We give it then to the browser, which is then given to the browser, and the browser will then create the content for our website. It will display the content. And the second language that we will start with is CSS, which is the appearance of the content. Meaning, if we write code in that language, that code will then be returned to the browser, and it will then be able to make the appearance of the content. So this is our first goal, getting familiar with HTML and CSS code, how it looks like, how it's written, the syntax in its jargon word. And our second goal today is to get familiar with the code structure that we must have inside an HTML file. And we may remember that whenever we create one of those HTML files, then NetBeans already gives us some beautiful code already, which we so far have deleted, because it's that code that's actually the structure, and we don't need to write that structure anymore because of NetBeans giving that to us already. But we will go over that structure in detail, and we take a look what we actually need to have there in order that ultimately then our code is considered to be valid by the web browsers. And that's the second goal of today. And lastly, today will be, again, it will be structure, and we want to get familiar with the structure that we have in here inside our server directory that we have here. So this one here, because we have loaded our website in here already, that's the reason why this is a representation of our server directory, in my case for the website WD216, meaning we can get rid of this window, and that's what I will do so right now, so we have a little bit more space here to work with. So let's go for our first goal that we have for today, we want to get familiar with HTML code and CSS code. And we have seen HTML code last week already, this button here. So whenever the browser reads this one, then it will display a button on the website. So once I hit enter now, then this is returned to the browser reads it and it knows, oh yeah, now I need to create a button on the website. And the instruction that tells him that it is now up to the browser to create something are these angle brackets that we are making use of here. This is the instruction to the browser, hey, you need to do something now. And whatever is written inside here is the type of instruction, what we want the browser to do. So this is the reason for code always having these special characters that we always associate with code. Because otherwise, if those characters weren't there, then the browser would think it's just text. Therefore, we cannot just say, make me a button, of course, because that is just text. And the browser would just display that text. So that's the reason why code always consists of those special characters. In this case, it's the instruction to the browser, hey, create something. And whatever is in here, this is what we want the browser to create. Now, whatever we write now afterwards will be written inside the button. Now, let me assume that I want some text, whatever else it is, some text that comes later. And I don't want that text to be written inside the button. Instead, it shall be written outside, right next to it. So let me reload the page, and nevertheless, the browser still displays that text inside the button. And now let us take a look at a default behavior that the browser does. It removes by default all line breaks and all white spaces. Apart from one single white space, that one it leaves us because otherwise our text would move on top of each other, and this is not what we want, of course. Otherwise the text would be unreadable, and therefore it always leaves us one single white space. But here we can see quite clearly that the browser has no chance. No chance what shall now belong inside the button and what shall be outside. So once again, it needs it needs an instruction again. And the instruction that we always use in HTML is again these angle brackets. And now we are telling the browser, hey, this is the end of the button. And that's indicated by a /. And then once again, we tell the browser what is ending now, what instruction is ending. So the button is ending now. So here, this is the end of the button. And whatever comes afterwards is then written outside the button. And in its plain form, therefore, the HTML code looks like this. It's always the instruction to the browser, now we want you to do something. And this is, now you are done. Now this is the end. And whatever we want from the browser will be written inside these angle brackets. As for example, let me go for a text area, which is one of those fields in which people who visit our website, they can write a message in here and then they can contact us. So click a button and then that data will be sent to us. And whatever, once again, we write in here, let me write in here, contact us, that one will be written inside that field. Once again, same procedure as with the button. So ultimately, these instructions are ultimately our content. And each of these instructions is one part of our content. And instead of referring to them as individual parts of the content, let us straight away go for the jargon word here. This is an element, this is an element. All these instructions are always elements. This is a button element, the entire thing here. And this is a text area element. And most of the time those instructions, those elements, they make quite sense. So if we give that to the browser, this instruction, most likely it will, or most certainly it will give us a button. Sometimes, however, it's not that straightforward to see what an instruction actually means, as in the case for the div instruction, the div element. And if the browser reads that instruction, it will create us one of those container boxes that any website out there is made up of. Those container boxes that provide the structure of a website. And whatever I'm writing in here now will be written inside that box. And right now we can see the text there, and the box is also there, but it doesn't have any appearance, any color, for example, that we would make that it would make it visible to us that there is actually now a container box. And how do we make the appearance of something? And that is now where we are introducing our second language, because it's our CSS language that makes the appearance of the content. Here is our content made up of individual parts, individual elements, and what we always do in CSS, we are selecting first of all from the content to determine what we want to give a certain appearance to. So in this case, let me select the div element. That one we want to give a certain appearance. And then come those strange angle brackets here, which I will go over in a second. And in between those angle brackets, this is where the specifications come, what we want that box now, what we have selected, what we want that element to appear on the page. So for example, we want that one to have a height of 80 pixels, and let me give it a background of red. And what do we think will happen now? The browser always needs an instruction to know what it needs to do, meaning right now it doesn't have one of those instructions, therefore it will think it is just text. So once again we need our HTML instructions, which consist of these angle brackets here, and here we are telling it this is the end of the instruction. And the type of instruction that we are now telling the browser, hey, now comes CSS code, is the style instruction. So this is the style element. And whenever the browser reads this instruction, when the HTML browser, the part of the browser that reads the HTML code, reads this instruction, it actually outsources that code to his body, let's say his body, because there is another part in the browser that reads the CSS code. There are two individual parts of the browser. One is able to read HTML code, the other one CSS code. And the CSS part of the browser, that guy that lives inside the browser, let's consider it a guy, even though of course a browser is just written in code once again, nothing else. But that part of the browser removes all white spaces and all line breaks as well. It doesn't even leave a single white space left, not even a single one, because the reason for this is in CSS, the white space is not needed because things never move on top of each other as they do in HTML. In HTML, the HTML part of the browser who reads that code needs to leave one white space there, otherwise the text would become unreadable. And in CSS, things are always nicely divided up by those special characters again. And this is once again the reason why we have those special characters, because they had to be there. Otherwise, things would be completely moving on top of each other, because this is the selection. We are selecting from the content. We want our container box to now receive a certain appearance. And here we are telling the browser, the CSS part of the browser, this is the end of the selection. Now comes what we want. And that what we want is again divided up by colon, and now comes how we want it. And that is divided up by semicolon, telling the browser, hey, this is now the end of the specification. Now comes a next specification, what we want again, and so on. And ultimately we have the closing angle bracket telling the browser, this is the end of the specifications, we are done now, this is the end, this is all what this container box will now receive, only these two instructions here. So this is the reason for those special characters, and were they not there, then it would not be divided up anymore, and the browser would have no clue what belongs to what. And of course we couldn't just say make it blue, we couldn't use the English language, because that one is just considered text, that one wouldn't work. So of course that's the reason in code that we always make use of those special characters. The indicator to the machine who ultimately reads the code. In this case, in our case, it's the browser. It reads that code, and by those special characters it knows when and what to do, when things start, when things end. So it is just for us that we always move things to a separate line, and that we also make usually a white space in between here, because we humans, we have eyes and we want things to be nicely readable, but the browser doesn't care. And the angle brackets, why they came up with these angle brackets was just the choice of the people who invented the language. But they needed one. They could have come up with any. but the point is they needed a certain special character. Now let me go over PX, which I haven't yet discussed. First of all, let me hit enter or reload the page, and here we have our container box having now received those specifications. And the PX stands for pixels. And we know most likely, or we have seen it last week as well, that any image is made up of pixels, and each pixel just has a certain color. And it is not just images that are made up of pixels, but also our computer screen or cell phone screen, whatever we are using, is made up of pixels. And therefore, everything that is opened on top of our screen, meaning such as our text area window, our browser window, everything ultimately is made up of pixels. Let us take a look at the Google website. Here we can enter our search term. It's a zoomed in version, and here we can see those pixels. They are always made up of red, green and blue, because out of these three colors we can create any other color that we want to. And what happens here is a certain amount of light shines through red, green and blue, depending on what technology we use, of course, but ultimately depending on how much light is shining through in between those three red, green and blue areas. This is ultimately determining what color will be there at that given point, at that given pixel. So for example here, ultimately it's the color black, and next pixel is black, black. So this is ultimately what we are telling here in CSS as well inside our browser, because our browser is opened on the screen and therefore it's also made up of pixels. So we are telling him make 80 pixels, 80 of those tiny areas, make it that high and give it a background color of red. Now there is a tiny difference, however, when we zoom in. Does that mean now that the pixels have become larger? The hardware pixels that are there inside our screen. And this is not the case. This is hardware. Hardware cannot change. But what is actually happening here, this is an exception, which we will go over later. But for now, all we want to assume, or all we want to know is when we say 80 pixel, then it's 80 of those screen pixels that we have here. And now let's go to our div element. Why is it saying div? It stands for division. And those container boxes, ultimately, they will provide us the structure of our website. And they are therefore the fundamental part that we will be working on in the very beginning. Because once we have our structure given by those container boxes, then we just need to fill these container boxes with whatever we want contained within them. So therefore they are dividing things up, and this is what div stands for, division. And let's straight away go for further container boxes to get our website structure. And what do we think happens now? We have now two container boxes, and what we have done in our CSS code is we have given those specifications to the content that is the div. And now both of them are the div and therefore are the divisions, and therefore they receive the exact same styling, the exact same appearance. And that is not what we want, however. We want that first box to look differently than our second box. And this is now where we are completing our HTML code. Because each of these elements, the div element, the button element or text area element, each of these elements, they can have sub-instructions, so-called attributes. Such as, for example, the ID attribute, which stands for identity. And here we can give that box its individual identity. We just need to give it a name now, or a value. That's the perfect word here. So this is the attribute, and then comes an equal sign, and those quotation marks will always be auto included by NetBeans already. We never need to write, but whatever name we give it now, whatever value must be in between those quotation marks. They can be single or double, that doesn't matter, but double is good, is fine, and this is what NetBeans by default uses. And in here we give a certain name, a value to that box, a certain ID value, and therefore we can then not only target our element by its actual type, it's a div element, but then we will target that one by its ID, meaning by its value that we give here, meaning then those specifications will then ultimately only be be applied to our box with that given ID that we do assign now. And in here we can use any name that we want to. I will call it header container. It's a common way to call container boxes CNT, so the abbreviation for container box. And one thing to pay attention here is that we cannot use white spaces. So we cannot use two words. It can only, because an ID can only have one single value. And now this is it has two values. So if we have two words, a value that consists, a name, a value that consists of two words, we either use underscore or dash, and I will be using underscore throughout this course in the HTML part. And now we have given it an ID, and let's now in CSS, what we always do, we select from the content and then give that certain content its specifications. And now we don't want to select that div element anymore, but we want to select it by its ID. And we do so by using the hash or pound symbol, telling the browser, hey, now we are selecting by ID. And we want the ID, we want the element with the ID header container to now receive these specifications here, which is only that very first container box that we have created. And therefore the second box will not be affected anymore, and it will not receive these two specifications here, the height and the background. Let me give that second container box straight away another ID as well. And because ID stands for identity, it must always, the value must always be unique. It cannot be used twice. Same as we human beings, our identity is unique. It is not there a second time. So meaning I cannot use header container here once again, the same name once again. So let me call it main container, for example. And now let me target this element by its ID. So once again, it's going to be the hash pound symbol and then the main container. And in here, let me also give that one a height, for example, of 300 pixel and a background of yellow, for example. And now our second box has its own individual appearance here applied to it. One more comment, which I just forgot actually. When we make up a value here, a name, an ID value, we can make use of numbers as well, but we cannot start with a number. And of course we cannot use any of those special characters. But as long as we keep it normal, then we don't have to follow any rules, then everything will be fine. Let me create straight away one other container box, because many websites out there are just built this way, which we will see in a second if we do not already. And let me call it footer container. And straight away, let's target this one here as well, the footer container, and give it its appearance straight away too. A height maybe of 30 pixels and a background of orange. And let me reload the page, and here we now have our header. Usually there is the logo inside here. On the right side, often it is the case that here are the language options or the login options. And then the yellow box, this is the actual content of our homepage in here. And in the footer, usually or often it is seen that there are for example, the privacy policy links, or for example, some other links that are important, copyright, etc. So this is how many websites out there that we most likely know and have seen, how they are made up in these three different sections here, divisions, three different container boxes. Now, so far we have text inside these container boxes. Besides text, of course, what we can also put in there, other elements as well, such as other container boxes. And let me create another of these container boxes and give it an ID straight away. And let me call it, in this case, child container, because it's a child of the yellow one. It's inside the yellow one, which I will go over later once again in more detail. I just name it this way. We can name it whatever we want to, as mentioned. And let me now give that child container also its appearance and give it, for example, also a width this time, a width of for example, 400 pixel, a height of 80 pixel, and a background of, for example, green. And let's take a look how the browser displays this one. Here we go. We have one of those container boxes now inside another container box. What happens if we now decide we want another of those container boxes, same as the green one, exactly the same one? Identity is of course unique, so therefore we cannot use the same value here. So what we could do, of course, we can just change the value to something else, such as adding a 2 afterwards, and then target that one, or use exactly, copy and paste those specifications underneath here, and then target our element with the ID child container 2, and that one then will also receive these specifications and will therefore also be green with a certain width and a certain height. Let me just write something in here that we can clearly see what box is what. And however, what we see now here is that we are duplicating our code, and that is never a good idea. Our code must be as short as possible without confusing us always. And another option that we have besides duplicating our code is just adding multiple selections in here. So we are selecting the element with the ID child container and now also a second element, and both of these elements, meaning this box, this element and this one, this container box and this one, will now receive both specifications without us having to duplicate any code, and with the result that everything is exactly the same, but it's a better way to do things because now we don't have unnecessary more code than needed. Another option that we have is, instead of assigning our elements the attribute an ID, we can also assign it a class. And as the name implies, it's not an identity anymore, therefore the value that we use to a class can be handed out multiple times, not only once. So therefore we can name them also both the same and using a class attribute. So meaning we can get rid of a double selection here. Instead we only select once, but we are selecting now not by ID anymore, which the pound or hash symbol is the representation of. Instead we are selecting by class, and that is represented by a period, telling the browser all the elements with the class child container, which are both of these here, both of these elements here. They now receive these specifications. So we have both options still resulting in exactly the same result. What option to use we will find out later over the weeks. We will become used to it when things are more appropriate. A major reason is that a class can have multiple values, meaning now we can use a white space, but now comes a second value that we assign to it. When we have an ID, we cannot use white space because otherwise this would be two values, and an ID can only be once. It can only exist once, therefore it can only consist of one single value. A class we can assign another value to. For example, let me just call it 2. And let us assume that our first box and our second box, they share the width and the height, but our second box has a different background color. And for example, a blue background. And therefore this second box will now be blue. I have given it a second class name and I have selected it by its second class name using the period which stands for class. Now what happens here is that the browser reads the same way as we human beings read a book. So it starts from top left and then it starts reading. It encounters the elements with a class child container, which happens to be 2 of them, and it assigns these specifications to these two elements here, to these here. And both of them will become green, but because this specification, this instruction comes later, the element with the class name 2 will now be blue. This one is ultimately overwriting this one. And this is always the case. What comes later then overrides the previous one. Always the case when we use the same selector. There are certain differences when we use a different selector here and a different here, then things change again. But that one we will discuss in week number 5, when we also go over what HTML and CSS actually means. So when we go into history a little bit, but for now we just want to go into practice and get familiar with code and start making websites until then. And this is now where we have elements. So this is always elements. This is a div element. This is a button element. This is a text area element. And each element, they can have attributes, such as an ID and a class. And these ID and class, they are global attributes, because any element can have these attributes. We can also give the button an ID or a class. We can give the text area an ID or a class, and any other element that we will introduce in the future as well. So these are global attributes, the jargon word for it, because they can be globally used on any element. And then there are also specific attributes, such as the placeholder attribute. Now let us take a look at the text area here. It's used for people who visit our website to contact us. So meaning if a person wants to contact us, that person wants to write us a message, it first right now needs to delete that text and then it can start typing, which is of course not very user friendly. So this is what the placeholder, for example, exists for. We can insert our message, what we want inside that field, inside as value inside the placeholder, contact us, and then this one will still be written inside here, our hint, what this field is about. But as soon as the person starts typing, then this message disappears and that person does not need to delete that message anymore, which is of course much more user friendly. And a placeholder makes sense for a text area or for an input field to have, but of course it doesn't make any sense for a button or a container box to have. So we also have specific attributes, not only global ones, but also specific ones that only one or some elements can have. And this is now where we have our entire code. We are done. And everything that will change now is the vocabulary. So instead of having a div, a button, text area element, we have of course further elements. And instead of having specific attributes such as the placeholder, there are other attributes, and there are also other global attributes as well. Same in CSS, everything that will change now is how we select things, and then here what we want and how we want it, that will ultimately change. But from its syntax, how the code looks like and how it's written, we are done, we have achieved our first goal. And one thing that's to finish up this code is now to get over the jargon, which is maybe a little bit of pain at the beginning always, then this jargon words that come across here. I think elements makes pretty much sense, because elements, this word is not only used on websites, but we can actually refer anything as elements. The elements of whatever, and these are the elements of our page, the div element, the button element, and all these elements ultimately make up our content of the website. And these elements consist of, it starts the element and it ends, the element is ending. And both of them, each of them is actually, or is referred to as a tag. This one is an opening or start tag. This one is a closing or end tag. And then we have the attributes, and here the values for the attributes. And in terms of CSS, what we always do throughout the entire HTML and CSS part, we always select from the content, and then we give that content its specifications. So this is the selector. And then what we want and how we want it. What we want is property, and how we want it is again the value, same as here. Property and value, and both of them together, property and value, is a CSS rule. And what I won't be using in this course, but which is nevertheless needed, because when we visit other websites out there or watch other videos about web development, this is just the jargon used by the people out there. So this one, for example, would be a CSS rule, which I refer to it always, or a CSS declaration. And this one is an entire declaration block. I will always, whenever I mention, in particular in the beginning when I mention those jargon words, I try always to highlight it, that we know what I actually mean by that jargon word. So this is the jargon for now, and this was goal number 1 for today, getting familiar with the code, with the syntax, how it looks like, how it's written. And now comes goal number 2, getting familiar with the code structure that we must have inside an HTML file that we are currently in. And in here there must be a certain structure in order for the browsers to consider our code as valid. So right now our code is invalid. because we did not yet follow this structure. Where is our content actually inside? It's inside this area here. This is ultimately the area where our content will be displayed. So this is, again, if we want, it's a container box. It's the ultimate container box. That inside that box, there is the entire content inside. And that box is represented in terms of HTML. So again, we have this structure. It's the body element. And that one has the entire content inside it. This entire content here. And therefore it is ending down here. This is where the body ends. And we usually, not usually, always move things in so we immediately know what is inside what. So to see the exact structure. So what we can do, we can mark it and use the tab key, or we can mark it and use here the shifting way by using these buttons here. Most likely the most convenient option, at least what I would assume, is always marking everything by using Control A and then using Alt, Shift and F for formatting. And that formats the entire page already. So in terms of the keyboard keys used here, now this example that I'm showing now, of course, completely depends on what keyboard we are using and what. So, but in case we have a similar keyboard and it helps us to know what it is. So Control A to select everything. And then ultimately it's Alt, Shift and then F for formatting together. Pressing these keys together will ultimately format then whatever we have marked. And we mark everything by Control A. And then using this shortcut, this is most likely, I would assume, the most convenient thing to format these things. And now we can see always what is inside what, which makes it much easier for our human eyes to see and to identify. This is the body element, and where there is a body element, there is also a head element. And that is another one that we must have on our website in order for our code to be valid. So we are starting the instruction again to the browser. Hey, now it's the start of the head, this is the end. And in here come all the things that are for the website and about the website. So the body has the website itself inside it, the content itself. And here are the things for and about the content, such as, for example, the title. And the title, let me just call it homepage for now. The title is the one that shows up here. It's also the title that ultimately shows up in the history. And it's also the title that will ultimately, once we are listed inside the search engines, will also show up here. So that's the title ultimately determined by that code here. And we can see that there's also always a description as well underneath the title. And that description, for example, would also be part here of the head, because it's something for or about the website that is in here. And the description is something about the content. It's the description about it. However, the description it's not a must to have, and therefore I will leave it out now and we will go over it later. Let's only go over those things that we must have in order that our code is considered to be valid. And there is only one more element in order then we have achieved a valid code, at least by having all elements on the page. And this last element is therefore the root element, because it's the very first element on the page and it contains everything else. It contains the head and the body, and therefore it will end down here. Let me mark everything again, format it, and here we can see it. The HTML element has everything else inside it. It's the root element, the very first element. And in actual fact, this element is not compulsory nowadays anymore, because if we leave it out, then the browser will automatically include it automatically. Ultimately, it's always there, whether we include it or we let the browser include it. But therefore, I just mentioned it. It's always there ultimately. So let me consider it in this case. It must be there, and therefore I'm going over it right now. And now comes one more instruction. One more. It's not an element, it's an instruction to the browser. It's also these elements that we are using. It also starts with these angle brackets here, And then, however, comes an exclamation mark. And then it says doctype HTML. And this is an instruction to the browser telling him it shall read our HTML code as if it was of the version 5 or later. And we are writing in the latest version, number 5 right now. And previous version were read by the browser, the code was interpreted, or read by the browser, parsed, the jargon word, was parsed differently. And therefore this instruction is very relevant and must always be there. Even if we are writing code in version 4, then we would need the instruction that we are writing in version 4. So the browser knows how to read our code ultimately. And there cannot even be a white space before. It must always be in the very first line, this instruction, instructing the browser how to read our code. And this is it now. Now we have everything that must be there. Nevertheless, we still have an error, because NetBeans is telling us something is wrong. And this is because of our CSS code. And that one, what is CSS code? It's the appearance of the content. And therefore it is something for or about the website. And therefore it belongs inside the head element, right in here. And here we go. And now everything is fine, our code is valid, and we have achieved our second goal of today, having gotten familiar with those structural elements, those structural instructions to the browser, including the first one here. And our website, of course, has not changed. The only difference is it's now considered to be valid. And now this is the code, that structural code, once again, that NetBeans always provides us with whenever we create one of those HTML files. So let us create one of those HTML files. But in this time, let us straight away go to our goal number 3 of today, where we want to get familiar with the structure, the directory structure that we have right here on the server. Now we loaded our server folder in here, that's why this is representing the server right here. And whenever we want a sub page, all we need to do is create another folder. And we name that folder whatever, and then we can include that here on the website. For example, I will now name my folder week 2, and that is exactly that folder then is another part of the URL. And once I hit enter now, then the browser will return. We are contacting the our local web server that hosts our website. Hey, give me the code that's inside WD216. There is another folder in there, week 2, and give me the code inside here. So therefore, each folder, each subfolder again has just its own code for the sub page then. So same structure as the home page. So we create a folder, and let me call it, in my case, let me call it week 2. For example, if our website was named shopping, then a subpage, for example, would be, of course, kitchenware or electronics, and then a subpage of electronics. If we even went for another folder now in here, then that one would, for example, be computers. So this is how we create subpages. Always a folder inside the other folder, and each of these folders then has the code for that certain subpage. And that one can be accessed always by / and then the name of the folder. And in here must be the code, first of all, now, that the server returns whenever I hit enter now. And what code that will be returned? So let me create an HTML file, first of all, and let's name it index once again, because this is, again, that's the code inside that HTML file. That one will be returned by default. That's the automatic action that the web server does. So this is now our code that we have here. The structural code that we have just gone over. Here is our instruction how the browser shall read our code in version 5 or later. This is our root element that contains the head, which has the things for and about the content, and the body, which has the content itself. And there are, as we can see, there are 2 more elements right here, which are not compulsory, but NetBeans already provides us those as well because they are relevant for later. The latter one, I only want to quickly mention something. It's later we will be making our website compatible or responsive, the jargon word, for mobile phones, meaning small screens and large screens as well, such as TVs. And this one is relevant for that one, so we can keep it in there. And this one is relevant how our characters that are coming in from the web server, how they shall be interpreted. And that one I quickly want to go over because we have discussed that one last week already. For example, let me once again, now let me hit enter. So here we are on the sub page, but let me go back to the home page and let me in here, let me create container box. Let me write there 3 certain characters. And now let us take a look what the browser, how the browser displays those. And it has no clue what those characters are. Because the reason for this is what we have touched on last week is that here, this is the ASCII code. And the ASCII code contains all Latin characters, meaning only A through Z and nothing else. And no other special characters. And when the browser reads the 1s and 0s that are coming in, then it uses this code. But we don't want him to use this code when we make use of other characters, such as this character. So therefore we need a different code. We want the browser to read the 1s and 0s by mapping it to a different code. And that one is the universal code, which has any other character inside it. And therefore we can ultimately use any character on our page, and the browser understands them and can display them correctly. So ultimately, once I include now this instruction here on my website as well, then everything will be fine with those characters. And this instruction, of course, must be in the head of the website. It's something for the website or about. It's the universal transformation format which shall be used. And now everything is fine on the website. It understands how to map them correctly, and it then can map these 1s and 0s to its according symbol, which is now these 3 ones, and everything is fine. There one more comment to these comments that are up here. Whenever the browser, we can make certain comments in our files. If we want to comment something, just a hint for us, give us a hint just to remember something maybe. And we will be making use of that later too, but rather in CSS than in HTML. Comments can be made by using again those angle bracket, exclamation mark, and then 2 dashes. And whatever comes after that instruction, after the browser reads that instruction, then it will neglect. It will not read that one. It will neglect it completely until we are telling him, now you shall read on again. And this is the instruction. Yeah, now we are done with commenting. You can now read that code again. That one is irrelevant for you. So these are comments. These are just comments that NetBeans makes us. We can remove them, and those ones can be done here as well. This is therefore now our sub page. And isn't it the case that any website we visit on the web, it's not any, but most of them, usually it's the case that the website and the sub pages, the home page and the sub pages, they share a certain structure, such as, for example, our red container box that we have here. Or, for example, the footer box as well, the header and the footer box. And the yellow box usually too, they have the same, at least the same background. And then the content in here will be different for the home page and the sub pages. But 3 of these boxes are usually shared, and some others as well, as we come across later. But therefore, let us copy and paste those 3 boxes over to our sub page, so that one also has the header, the main part, at least the background, the main box here, and the footer. And here we can see how static HTML is, because we cannot make reuse of HTML. So we could not put this structure in a separate file and then somehow say include that structure, meaning that this code is then only at one location in one file. This is just not possible with HTML, because HTML is considered to be a static language. And we need a language such as PHP that we will be making use of later in order to make reuse of HTML file. So what we need to do here now is copy paste things over and reuse, duplicate our code. Meaning if we want to change something here inside the header, then we also need to change it here, which is of course a pain. And therefore a use of a language such as PHP is nowadays, or not nowadays, it's just inevitable not to use such a language such as PHP, which we will be doing later onwards. But for now we need to copy and paste things over. Let me call that one here subpage. And now we will see that CSS in actual fact With CSS code, that is not the case. We don't need to copy and paste things. Instead, CSS code can be reused, but only when we do not make this CSS code in here as we did so inside our head element. We used the style element to tell the browser, hey, now comes CSS code, give that to your friend to read. And this one, if we make it this way, then in actual fact we need to copy and paste things over here as well. But if we put that one in an external file, then we can make reuse of CSS code. So this is one reason why we would never put CSS code in here apart when we are quickly testing something, for example. Another way, a third way to give our content here its appearance would be by a global attribute called style. A global attribute are always the ones that can be used on any element. So this one can be used on the div element, the text area, and many other elements, and all other elements. And in here we can use exactly the same syntax, the same way as we do in CSS. Property and value. What we want, how we want it. Exactly that one in here. And now our button is blue as well. But this one we would never do either, because for the first reason is, a major reason is because then we cannot reuse the CSS code. Another reason is that things shall always be separate. HTML and CSS code shall always be divided up, because later that code will of course become greater and greater, and to oversee it, it's much better to have things separate. So this one we would never do. This is not the way we would give our content its appearance. And this is also not the way how we would give our content its appearance. Instead, what we would do always in an external file. And this is what we are creating now. And let us create one of those external files in here, which leads us straight to our third goal of today, getting familiar with that structure here. So let me create a CSS code, cascading style sheets, which we will learn later why this language is named this way. And a common way to name this file is styles. This is just a common way. We can of course name it whatever. And here again, here are comments, and inside a CSS file, comments are done differently. As we see, it's always done by a / and an asterisk. And in actual fact, inside CSS, I'm making comments very often. So in here, they are very relevant to us. However, for now, let me remove those comments from NetBeans, which we don't need, and put our CSS code in here. This of course means that we now need to include that CSS file in here somehow, because right now there is nothing here anymore. No appearance to our content right now. There is no CSS. We need to include that file now. So what happens now is, let me go over that process. Whenever we enter our website address, in my case this one, then the wheel starts to turn only very quickly, because there is not a lot of ones and zeros having to come back, and the ones and zeros are only traveling on our own computer and are not coming back from Africa, Australia, or wherever, so it only turns very quickly. But as soon as I hit enter, again, I'm contacting my local web server now. Hey, give me the code, and then the code comes back. The HTML code is always the first thing that comes back, because the content is the fundamental thing of our website. Without content, there is no appearance of the content. So the HTML code is the first thing that comes back to us. And then the browser starts reading, and then it encounters an inclusion, what we are going over now. And here we include something again with our syntax, what we always use in HTML, the angle brackets, the instruction to the browser, hey, now we want you to do something. And what we want now, we want to include something using the link instruction, the link elements. And here we need two different specific attributes in order that this one works now, this inclusion. The relationship and the hyperlink reference attribute. The relationship, what we must determine in what relationship is the including file to the content. And ultimately it's going to be the appearance or the styling. And the style sheet is the answer here. Always when we include CSS and an external CSS file, we use the relationship style sheet, the value for it. And hyperlink reference, hyperlinks, hypertext was once again, hypertext is clicking on some text, jumping somewhere else, what we are doing on the web the entire time. And here again we are hyperlinking somewhere, jumping. We want the browser to retrieve something from the server again here, hyperlink reference. And here we are telling the browser to where on the server, what it shall tell the server, where it can fetch that file from. And currently we are having this file inside our site root folder. Let me put it in here. So our home page right now is inside our home page folder, the site root folder, and our styles are also in here, meaning all we need to do now is just mention that name, nothing else, including its extension CSS. That's it, and then everything works fine. And what happens here is the browser reads the code. Once it gets it, the HTML code, it reads, and then it encounters this hyperlink reference, meaning it's going out to the server once again. So there is another request going on. Hey, give me the code. And then the code comes back, this time the CSS code. And the browser is telling the server ultimately where to find that code, where it is, where it is located. And this is what we just have done by using this hyperlink reference. Let us go to our subpage for a second, week 2. And in here, of course, we also need to include now the CSS file. And here we see that we can reuse the CSS code because we can also use it here. Meaning ultimately the CSS code, the entire code will be here for the home page, for all subpages, for any page of our website. The entire code will be inside this one single file here. Usually, and later we will see how we can also divide things up when necessary. But for now, it's all in that file. And all we need to do on our subpage is to also include this file. However, this one is not yet working because right now we are on our subpage. And we want to tell the web server where it can find the styles. So we need to move up first, one folder up, and then we can include it. So one up, and then we can determine styles CSS. And going one folder up is represented by period. And then folders are always divided by /. And once we have done so, then everything is fine. And also our subpage has now, this inclusion of that CSS file has now wonderfully worked also for our subpage. This is therefore a major reason why we always put CSS externally. And now I'm introducing another reason. And let me once again use our example website that we have made use of last week the entire time. So the IMDb website. That one is, the code for that website is located in Seattle in the United States, meaning as soon as I hit enter now, my browser is requesting that code from Seattle. And then what comes back? The HTML code comes back, the CSS code ultimately comes back, the JavaScript code as well, and then the browser can make up this website. Now, whenever I hit a link now, then the CSS code, then again it goes out to the server and retrieves the code for the subpage. So I'm hitting now, and then again I'm going to Seattle, something is going to Seattle telling the browser, telling the server in Seattle, hey, give me the code for this subpage now. Meaning the code is coming back, but only the HTML code is coming back. Because the CSS code and also JavaScript code, when it is in an external file, then it can be cached or stored. Cached is the jargon word, but it can be stored by the browser. Meaning it does not need to be retrieved anymore. Whatever subpage we now visit on this website, once we have visited it once, the CSS and JavaScript code is stored by the browser and does not need to be claimed from the web server again, which is great, meaning there are less ones and zeros that need to come back, meaning this speeds things up and also helps the server in Seattle. So this one, there are no congestions, and so there are many advantages. There are less traffic it causes ultimately, and our browser can display the website more quickly as well. Wonderful thing that the CSS code can be stored. And this only happens when it is inside a CSS file separately. And now comes the hint, the hatch, or what's it called? Now comes the problem for us, because right now we are developing a website. Meaning, if we do changes to our CSS code and then reload the page to make those changes, we then want to see those changes visible on the website. We won't see them because the browser is using a stored version of our CSS code, and the stored version has not included those changes yet that we have made. Therefore, in this case, when we are developing a website, this is a problem. And one option that we have and that we will be making use of later in a dynamic way is we can always add another name after a question mark here. And whatever name that is, usually it's version 2 or version 3, whenever we have changed something, and when the browser encounters a different name after the question mark, then it knows, oh yeah, now I need to retrieve it again. I cannot use the stored version because here is now a different name. But this is one way that we will be making use of later. However, for now, the absolute most convenient thing is to download this toolbar, which allows us to disable the cache during our development phase. So we never need to worry about it anymore. A link to this developer toolbar, Firefox developer toolbar, which we make use of not only for this purpose, but for many other things as well later, is in the description, of course, this link, or in the notes once again as well. And here we must have a tick here. Disable entire cache, meaning don't store any CSS and also not JavaScript code. And this means that whenever we do changes now inside our CSS code, then those changes become immediately visible to us, which is of course a must during the development phase of our website. Let us now get further familiar with the structure of our directory here. This is the directory structure, and let us now link the homepage to the subpage. And for example, let me insert some text here, go to subpage. And of course, this one ultimately shall be clickable text. This one shall be clicked. So links are part of the content. So our plain instruction once again will be this one here. And the instruction type this time is the A, standing for anchor. So we want that text to behave like an anchor. Kind of makes sense what an anchor is. It's an anchor to somewhere. This leads to somewhere, or this is the anchor to somewhere else. Kind of makes sense. The only thing now is it's not yet working, because we of course first need to determine the path. So right now this text is not yet clickable. So how do we determine the path to somewhere? We have used it up here already. So once again, let us make use of the hyperlink reference where this jump is leading to. So this is hypertext, and this is the hypertext, and this is the hyperlink reference where that text ultimately leads to. And where do we want to go? We are on the home page, and we want to go into the week 2 folder. And this is all we need to do then, week 2. And we do not need index.html, because whenever we are contacting the folder to give us the HTML code, then this is the default. Index is always the default returned, so we don't need to specify that one. Week 2 is absolutely fine. And now our link is working. We can click it and we are jumping to our subpage, meaning we are going to the server again and tell the server, hey server, now give me whatever you have inside the week 2 folder. And then this one gets returned to us. And once it is there, then the browser starts reading, and then it encounters the CSS file, which is not yet stored because we have prevented it from storing. And then it retrieves the CSS file, and then it reads on, etc. And ultimately CSS and HTML are combined, and the browser displays the entire website, the content, and the appearance of the website. So let us make one of those anchors now on the subpage. So where do we need to go? Where do we need to tell the browser what file we want? We need to tell them we need to go one folder out. In my case, because I'm on the subpage here now. So if we were on a subpage, we would need to go 2 folders out. Meaning period, / dividing the folders up, period, / also dividing the file up. But we are not including the file, so because that one is returned by default always, the content of the index. So all we need to do right now, because I'm in the sub folder, everything that needs to be done here is I actually copied the wrong thing here over, and all that needs to be done is period, that's it. So this is jumping to the home page again, one folder out. And let me reload the page and of course call that one home page. And then once I click it, going to the home page, going to the sub page, everything is working fine. And to get further used to this folder structure, let us therefore also introduce an image, because whenever we are including an image, then we are telling the browser to go to the server again to retrieve this image. Therefore, the instruction in HTML once again is this one, and it goes like img, image. And here we have one specific attribute where we determine the path once again. But this time the path is not the hyperlink reference. There is a technical difference here. Therefore, we are using source. So what is one difference at least is when the browser reads and then it encounters this one here, a path to the server to retrieve the CSS file. Until that file is not yet here, then it will not continue reading. Now the other way around, then it still continues on reading, even though that file is still on the way. But that's different with an image. Here it waits until the image has arrived, and then it continues on reading. So this is one technical difference. There are a little bit more, and which I don't want to go over now. But in here, same thing. We just determine the path, same as with hyperlink reference. And in here, we first of all need an image inside our directory here. Let me drag an image inside the site root here. So inside where the home page is, that's also where the CSS file is, and also where the image is. So once again, all we need to do, because the home page is in the same folder, in the home page folder, the root folder is in the same folder as the image. So all we need to do is specify the name and the extension en.png, and that's it. And then everything is fine, en.png, and here is our image. Now, one thing that I forgot to mention is that we all already saw here and also here is that there are some elements that do not close. And those elements do not close because they cannot have any content. There can neither text nor can there be any other element inside it. And therefore we do not close these elements. In actual fact, it's an error to close it. What NetBeans then always straight away tells us, you cannot do this. Elements that do not have any content do not close, and there are only 6 elements out there that do not close, and 3 of them we have already seen now, the image, the link, and the meta element. And this image now we have included here is fine for now. We still don't have a mess here, but ultimately we have many more images here, and we have videos and other things, other media that we are including. So ultimately things are getting very messy here. So let us provide structure, make structure here straight away, which also gives us a couple of further examples how to include things, how to contact the web server where things are. So our third goal of today. So let me give that folder a name media, which is a common way to name it. We can name it, of course, whatever. And in here shall all be the files that will be included on the website, such as the CSS files. So I make straight away another folder in here with CSS, and straight away also another folder called images, and in here will be the images. And now let me drag the image inside the image folder and the CSS inside the CSS folder, and let me now reload the page, and of course now everything is broken because now the inclusion is wrong. Now our structure doesn't look like this anymore, but it looks like this. So here is our home page, and the CSS file is located 2 folders down, inside the media folder, inside the CSS folder, and then we can include it. So meaning that's what we need to specify as the path here, where the request shall go to. So we are requesting now the folder media CSS /style CSS. So this is the request sent to the server. Hey, give us whatever you have inside the media folder CSS, and then give us that file here, style CSS. And now everything is fine again. Here we go. And also with the image, so the image is now located also inside media images, and then the file, Therefore, same thing here. So it's media always divided up by the forward slashes, and then it's images / and then comes the file. And then the image is there again. Let me go to the subpage, which is broken now as well, of course. So right now we are on the subpage. So one folder out and then media, CSS and styles. So whenever the browser reads it, so I need to go where? I need to go one folder out from this file, and then media, then styles, no rubbish, then CSS, and then styles CSS. And now everything is fine here again as well. One option that we have that I will not make use of in this course, but that option exists that I want to briefly discuss, which is another element that doesn't close, that is part of the head. Because it's something about the website. We are we can determine here a base path. So we do not need to always use the period. If that confuses us too much, that system, or always we don't want to think, we are too lazy, maybe whatever it may be. We don't want to think whether we need to go one folder out or two folders out. What we can do, we can determine a base path that that shall always be used when a request is made to the server. So a base path meaning a beginning path. Start from here. And that one shall be always the homepage folder. So start from the root folder. And we determine here again by href, hyperlink reference. And then in here we can determine the root path to the root folder of our website. Meaning we don't need these periods anymore. In actual fact, it's not now not working anymore because we have those periods. So these ones must go away. And that's not only for including things, but also our link home is broken now because those periods are there which we don't need anymore. It goes to the homepage and then go homepage. Now it works fine. So I don't make use of it, but this option exists if it helps us. One thing to pay attention here is, first of all, it doesn't close. I think now we almost have all elements that do not close. And that's the fourth one of 6 elements. And another thing we need to pay attention to is that it must always be before the link. Of course, before the first inclusion happens, this one must be there already, of course. And one other thing is the / must always be there as well. So if we make use of it, then those things we must pay attention to. So I won't be making use of that one, but as we know, this one is possible because it completely fit the topic right now. So therefore I mentioned it. And this is it. Now we have achieved our last goal of today. We have gotten familiar with the structure that we have here. And this is now it. What we are now discussing briefly is I want to give you a couple of shortcuts for a second that we can use inside our HTML file here. So first of all, what happens with the image element? That one of course gets included as well. So the HTML file is always the one coming back first whenever we enter our website. HTML file comes back, browser reads, then it encounters a hyperlink reference, goes to the server again. Hey server, give me media CSS, style CSS. That file comes back, browser reads, comes to the image. Hey server, give me whatever you have inside media, images, en. So it's 3 times that there is a request made right now to the server. Between browser and server, 3 times that there is a communication going on. And now let me go over a couple of shortcuts. For example, this one here, which is Control, Shift and C together. Once we are on that line, we can comment something out or uncomment something, which is very useful as well. So in terms of keyboard, of course, it depends what keyboard we have, but if it helps us, so it is Control, Shift and C together, those ones. And another one I want to discuss is Control F, which we maybe know, or most is a likelihood that we know it already, same as Control H from a Word or Excel document. So here we can find something, Control F, or Control H to find something and replace it, which becomes very relevant in CSS later too. So therefore I quickly wanted to discuss those as well. And now I want to go over our code that we will be learning over the coming weeks, which is this one here. So this will be our vocabulary. These are the notes that can always be downloaded. The other notes are actually here, but here's also the vocabulary. This is our entire vocabulary. So, but always what we do whenever we write code in HTML and CSS, meaning throughout the next 17 weeks, we create content by writing these elements. And then what we do in CSS, we select the content and then we give that content its appearance. And that appearance can be divided up. We give that content everything that relates to dimensions. We give that content how it shall be positioned, and we give that content its styling in general. So this is what we will always be doing. Create content by writing those elements, select it, and then give it its appearance. And next week we will be right here into dimensions. So we will be giving our content its dimensions, in particular referring to container boxes, because these container boxes, they just provide the structure for our website. So that's the main part that we will be starting with. So next week is all about dimensions, and we will also be starting to position things and using the display property. So here and display. And we will see that HTML is a very simple language. It's just an effort to learn the vocabulary. CSS is rather more difficult. So in particular referring to positioning. That one is the tricky part here. And that is the major one that we will actually be focusing on over the coming weeks. And therefore CSS has the major focus in this course part of HTML and CSS. Then here are always the attributes. The global ones are here that we have, meaning the global ones are that any element we can give these attributes to, and then here the individual ones can be found inside HTML detail. So here are also the explanations of the individual elements. If we forgot something, here's always the details about it. And we will always be starting with an empty sheet, or with a sheet with only the vocabulary that we have so far gone over. So right now, what we will not touch again, at least not in detail, what we have done today is all the structural ones, the head and the document elements. So all these ones, this instruction here, HTML head, body, inside the head is the title. Then the style can be used inside HTML to include, to use CSS inside HTML, which is a bad idea as we saw. Then the link element is the appropriate way to include CSS. Here we determine include a file externally. So we are going to the server again to include the CSS. And then the space path that I just mentioned at the end as well. And div, that's our container. So images, button, text area that we have seen, or anchor, for example. I just mentioned them, so we already know them because they are so relevant on any website, and that we had more material to work with to get familiar with the server structure, because an anchor and image, we are always going to the server again. But those ones we will go over again, so there are more details to talk about concerning those elements. Those ones we have discussed yet, and concerning CSS, we have selected either by type, meaning in terms of code, we have selected by type. Let me once again select something by type, which I haven't done yet. For example, the body, which is our ultimate container box. We can actually give a background color as well, of course, or an image later. So that's going to be then our complete website image background. And let me just load the page. So now it's light gray. So body is the entire area. So we can select by element. It's by the type, element type, which is here. Then we can select by ID, by class, and we also saw that there are multiple options. We can select multiple elements at the same time. So this one doesn't need to be an ID. This one can be a class, and this one can be an ID. But here the comma is just separating two selections, whatever they are based on. And these are the selectors we have learned. Then the properties that we have gone over as examples here, height, background, all of them are coming again next week. We are starting with dimensions. These were just used as examples here. And now come two last things I want to discuss, which will help us in the coming weeks to much better follow this course. If we already from scratch from the beginning think this way. And that is inside our HTML file. We have always a certain structure. And we always know by indenting things here, we always know what belongs inside what. And these are therefore, everything that is inside something are children of that something. So this HTML element has two children, the head and the body element. And the head element has three children, title, meta, and link. And these three elements, they are siblings. And this title element, its parent is the head element. And the title element's grandparent is the HTML element. So we are thinking in terms of trees. And this is what the browser ultimately does as well. It thinks itself of trees. And same with our folder structure, it's a tree. And if we think in trees, it's much better already if we do so from the beginning. Because one reason, for example, is later we will later select in CSS from the content, select the next sibling, select all the children, select the parents, select this one, always thinking in this hierarchy, in this tree structure. Same as in real life with our family structure. The only difference is that there is only one parent. But otherwise, if we think this way, it will help us a lot. Also, one thing that will help us a lot is to understand that wherever the code is, this is where it will display on the page. So this is our the code for the red container box, and therefore the red container box is listed first. If I move that red container box underneath the yellow box, then this red box will be underneath the yellow box. So right now everything is considered to be in the flow. Where the code is, this is where it will be ultimately also be displayed on the page. This is in the flow, and if we think this way as well, if we are aware of this as well, it will help us tremendously in the coming weeks. And this is it for now. So next week it's all about dimensions. So all about CSS, giving our content its dimensions, in particular container boxes, and also starting to position these container boxes.